from the campus of Weber State University in Ogden, the Utah Debate.
Good evening, I'm Glenn Mills, honored to be your moderator this evening. Welcome on behalf of the Utah Debate Commission. We're pleased to come to you tonight live from Weber State University's Brown Center. Tonight, we are hearing from three candidates who have met the qualifications for this debate. The candidates are Carlton Bowen, John Curtis, and Caroline Gleich. We are looking forward to a lively and civil debate tonight with the goal of giving Utah voters first-hand exposure to candidates and good information for your decision-making. A random drawing held prior to tonight's debate determining that candidate Bowen will get the initial response to the first question. We will then alternate turns on the remaining questions throughout the debate. So on that note, candidates, let's begin with this question. Talk to us about why you're interested in the job and why you believe you're the most qualified person to represent our state as its next senator. Mr. Bowen, we'll start with you.
Well, welcome. And to my Weber State University alma mater and all who have been involved to help this debate happen, thank you. My name is Carlton Bowen. I'm running to be your U.S. Senator replacing Mitt Romney. And a lifelong Republican, I ran as an independent American to ensure that you have a pro-Trump conservative option on your ballot. I'm for the U.S. Constitution, and I'm running on a platform of traditional values, traditional money, and our tradition of freedom. Traditional values, it's so simple and basic, it's almost silly that we need to talk about it. But we're at a point in our nation's history where we do need to stand up for what we believe in and be silent no more. So boys are boys and girls are girls. In other words, there are only two genders, male and female. Marriage is between a man and a woman.
All right, your minute for that first response is up, so we're going to have to move on. Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis. The question goes to you. Talk about why you would like to have this job and what qualifies you the most.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you to the Debate Commission. Thank you to my two opponents. I look forward to a delightful conversation with you tonight. You know, when I was a young man starting out a business, I had a mentor who told me that when you hire, look for a pattern of success. So with that in mind, I shared just a few highlights from my life. As a young man, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, so with my business partners, we jumped in and we had a business and we worked hard and were successful and became world-renowned for our product and successfully sold that business. After that, I ran and was successful in being the mayor of Provo, where we learned how to cut budgets, cut government spending, and enjoyed a 94% approval rating. And as many of you know, for the last 7 years, I've represented Utah's 3rd congressional district, where I was just recently rated the #9 most effective legislator in all of Congress, and my office was rated #1. Most important, 42 years of marriage, 6 kids, and 42 grandkids.
Ms. Gleich, the final response on this question goes to you. Talk about why you want the job and why you feel you're most qualified.
I was inspired by the call for the next generation of leaders to step up because it's our generation that's going to have to deal with the issues that Congress is failing to address right now. Utahns are frustrated by the lack of action on the most pressing issues and challenges they're faced with today. Things like housing affordability, attacks on our public lands, the lack of real action on immigration and the air quality and these overall challenges that we're facing. And we cannot keep sending the same kind of politicians and expecting a different result. It's time to change the people that we send to be our leaders. I'm Caroline Gleich. I'm a small business owner, skier, mountaineer, and your candidate for U.S. Senate. And I got my start working on politics with Ted Wilson, who was Governor Gary Herbert's environmental advisor. I've worked on policy at the local, state, and federal levels. I've testified to the House and to the Senate, and I helped to pass the largest clean energy bill in United States history. And if you are ready for change, join me, and please, Utah, vote Caroline Gleich for U.S. Senate by November 5th.
Our next topic is the debt, the national debt, approaching an astounding $36 trillion. That's a number that most of us can't even comprehend when we try to think about it. And quite frankly, voters have heard a lot of lip service from politicians when it comes to this issue. So talk about specific ways you would chip away at this debt. Also would like to get your ideas on whether or not you believe we can get back to a balanced federal budget. Mr. Curtis, you first.
I believe the path to Washington, D.C. is littered with politicians who've said they're going back to fix the deficit. As a matter of fact, the deficit today is 300% larger than when we sent the Tea Party back to Washington, D.C. to fix it. It's clear that what we're doing is not working. One of the points that I've been advocating for in Washington, D.C. is a model done here in Utah. It's called a baseline budget. At the beginning of every legislative session, they agree that if they don't agree on a budget, instead of going into a shutdown or a CR or an omnibus, they actually continue on last year's budget. If we could enact that one thing in Washington, D.C., I think that would do more to bend the spending curve than anything else we do. Last year, I was successful with Thomas Massey in getting a similar amendment put into it. It was a little bit different. It had a minus 2% penalty. I actually think a better option would have been to stay on the current budget, because they just did an omnibus because of the 2%. So that's what I'm working on, and hopefully we can be successful at.
Ms. Gleig, talk to us about how you would approach the national debt.
Well, I grew up with a family value of frugality. My parents sewed their own sleeping bags and outdoor equipment. And then as a small business owner, I carried forward that same ethos of not spending more than I brought in and making sure to save for emergencies. And we need the federal government to do the same thing, because right now, future generations like mine are going to be saddled with this enormous burden. Currently, the interest on the federal debt is more than the entire federal budget, and this situation is completely unsustainable. So as Utah's next U.S. Senator, I would close the billionaire tax loopholes that allow someone like Jeff Bezos to pay an effective 1% tax rate. And I would work to end other loopholes for corporations to bring more money in as revenue. And we're not going to achieve this unless we change who we send to be our elected officials.
Mr. Bowen, your thoughts on the national debt?
We're running on a platform of traditional money, which means more than using the gold and silver coin our founding fathers envisioned and that the U.S. Constitution still requires. It also means a free market capitalist economy, not crony capitalism, not communism, not socialism, but a true free market where consumers, not the government, choose the winners and losers. It also means fiscal responsibility with balanced budgets and reducing the national debt. I agree with Mr. Curtis that what we've been doing is not working, because when both parties are in office, they're both increasing the debt. It doesn't matter if either party controls all the branches of government, the debt continues to go up. So we need to do something different. I want to finish my last statement about traditional families, because it's important. Families are extremely important. We need to make sure that, and ideally they have a mom and a dad, married, trying, and true. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't kill. Honesty and integrity still matter.
All right, thank you very much. We'll now turn to a question from Collins Nelson. He is a student here at Weber State University.
Utah has long been called the best state to live in, but current rising housing costs and costs of living are pushing many young Utahns like myself to leave the state for economic reasons. What specific plans do you have to ensure that Utah is affordable for all Utahns, students and young professionals included?
Ms. Gleig, that goes to you first.
Well, thank you for that question. And on the campaign trail, I've heard from a lot of students like yourself. I've heard from folks that are working multiple jobs, going to school full-time, and they're still struggling to pay for their rent or for their mortgages, or they're worried about being one healthcare crisis away from losing the roof over their head. And that is not okay, because we need to ensure that future generations have the same potential to live the American dream. So as Utah's next senator, I would support expanding a first-time homebuyers tax incentive to help people get into the purchase of their first home. I would also support developing a federal agency to study how many Americans and Utahns are experiencing homelessness and what are the factors that are leading people to have to live on the streets. And we can do a lot better for young people in addressing this by also raising the federal minimum wage up from $7.25 an hour, because I don't know about you, but I could not get out of the grocery store for less than $50. And if you're getting paid minimum wage, that's a full day's work.
Mr. Bowen.
I would like to point out that this is a state and local issue, not a federal issue. But there are a couple of things that the federal government does that impact it. And this falls under my traditional money platform pillar. So I'm against socialism, and I'm also against price controls. And what we have with interest rates, which is a huge part of housing affordability, is a price control by the Federal Reserve, where they artificially set what interest rates are. And we've seen that where interest rates have gone to 2% to 7% in a little more than a year's time over the past year. This limits the free market. I would like to see a free market rate, which I think then would work better. Also, I don't agree with the state legislation that rewards builders, which are special interests, by making state credits only available for example, for new construction. And the other part of this is inflation. The federal spending is driving the inflation. That's what is driving the housing prices.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Curtis, the final response goes to you.
Yes, I would actually like to agree with a couple of points to Carlton. Let me start with the state, city, county role. A lot of this can be done at that level, but there is a role for the federal government. As you mentioned, inflation is one of the single biggest problems, and right now you have to point squarely at the federal government. They taught me when I was at BYU that inflation is the result of too much money spending too much money on too few goods. And what are we doing as a federal government? We're turning on the faucet of spending, and we're putting our neck on the supply chain. We need to do those two things. I have some specifics as well. We just introduced me and my staff this week. It's called the Homes Act. It actually allows those of us who have IRA money. Currently, you can use IRA money to invest in real estate, but you can't do it for your own home or your children's home. My bill would actually change that. I would also point out Senator Lee's bill, the Houses Act, which lets us use federal land for housing here in Utah. That would be a very big deal.
All right, thank you very much. Definitely a topic on the minds of many, as we've seen our home prices skyrocket seemingly overnight not too long ago. Another contentious topic here in the state of Utah would be public lands. Many disputes between the state and the federal government. In fact, as of late, we have really seen the pendulum swing depending on what party controls the White House. So let's now get into what to you defines a successful partnership when it comes to managing our public lands, and also how would you work to foster that? The first response to this question goes to you, Mr. Bowen.
Yeah, well, one of the things I would do when elected is to rewrite the Antiquities Act. This act has been abused by Presidents Clinton and Obama and others to set aside millions of acres of Utah land. Bears Ears is larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, and it wasn't done with congressional input. It just took President Obama signing that. President Clinton did the Grand Staircase Monument, and these monuments locked up public roads that Utahns used and had privately owned lands inside of them. I really appreciated what President Trump did. I am the only pro-Trump candidate on the ballot, as my Republican opponent, a former Democrat, refuses to endorse President Trump and actually called for his censure and for an impeachment inquiry. So I think we can do a lot with federal lands.
Mr. Curtis, we go to you. I'm going to point out that does warrant a rebuttal, so you will get 30 seconds to do that. So let's first, though, get to your approach on public lands and what would beneficial partnership between the state and federal look like. And then once we get through this round, I will give you your 30 seconds rebuttal time.
Good. Thank you. I don't think there's any better example of what the right relationship between the federal government and the state government is than the Emory County Public Lands Act. I think as I look back on my time in Congress, I'll be most pleased and proud of that specific act, which actually took 1.3 million acres and designated where we would graze, where we would recreate, where we would extract, and where we would protect. And we put that through congressional legislation so that today it's law. The only way you get that through congressional legislation is if you actually have consensus between the environmental groups, between ranchers, between off-road enthusiasts. That trumps an Antiquities Act, and that is the way to beat the Antiquities Act, which I agree is being overly abused. It's hard to do, but that's Congress's job, and one of the very most important things we can do as we look at monuments like Escalante and Bears Ears, if we can move those through in congressional legislation, we can solve once and all the back and forth.
Okay. Ms. Gleick, your thoughts on public lands?
Our public lands are our national treasures, and when I was growing up, I really struggled with anxiety and depression, and I found a lot of happiness and healing through my time on Utah's federally protected public lands. And I know so many other people feel the same way. These lands are places that we should be able to go to find that joy and that refreshment from life. And right now, our public lands are under attack. And we have seen this massive effort to transfer our federally protected public lands to state control. And we know the vast majority of the time that happens, they are sold to the highest bidder for energy development, mineral extraction, and so that politicians can line their pockets with the sale and privatization for other development, and they're closed forever. This is wrong. And we've seen these attacks on the Antiquities Act before, and continuing these attacks, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. We need a champion in the U.S. Senate who will work on the Budget and Appropriation Committee to get our public lands the federal funding they deserve.
Mr. Curtis, it was brought up about you specifically. One, a former Democrat, now Republican, and two, referring to the impeachment. You'll have 30 seconds rebuttal time. Yeah,
I'm actually going to fight the urge to rebut that. I don't think it's worth the time of those watching. My record on President Trump is clear. When President Trump is doing things that are in line with Utah values, I'm 100% behind him, wind at his back. And my record also shows that when he's not, I'm not afraid to push back. And I think that's what Utahns really want. And with that, I'll yield my time.
Okay. We're going to move on to water then, a very important topic here in the state of Utah with our rapid population growth and agriculture demands. Really, how do you balance those is what we want to get into. So as Senator, how would you work with multifaceted governments, including the federal, state, and local entities to really craft what is needed here, which would be an innovative solution to meet our water needs, both urban and rurally, but also for a long-term sustainability? Mr. Curtis, this goes to you.
Yeah, I want to start with agriculture is not the enemy. And I'm afraid, if not careful, we tend to demonize our good friends in agriculture. And I actually believe not only are they not the enemy, sorry, double negative, they are the solution to this, and we need to be listening to them. I'd also love to point out this last week we concluded our third annual Conservative Climate Caucus Summit where we talk about these issues. I literally had a businessman approach me today and said, I will raise $1 million to put up as a prize for the people who come up with the most innovative water conservation solutions at your next summit. And so I think that combination of the private sector, of not demonizing agriculture, of using Utah's innovation will help us solve this in a way that will help us grow and prosper the way that we'd like to do it.
Ms. Gleick, what are some innovative ways we can approach the water situation here in our state?
Well, one of the top concerns that I've heard from Utah voters is about this, and especially about what's happening to our Great Salt Lake, because right now our Great Salt Lake is at a record low, and this exposed lake bed with the toxic minerals is causing this dust to blow. And I think about my baby nephew, and I think about his lungs and the poison that he is being exposed to. And it's not okay. We are not going to dam our way out of this. And currently 71% of the water diverted from the Great Salt Lake is going to agriculture. So not only do we need to speed up water conservation methods to get more water to the Great Salt Lake, we also need to redefine and revamp our entire Western way of looking at water, because the entire Colorado River Basin is connected. And water is a finite resource. We're not going to get another drop. We also need action on the climate crisis. And we cannot keep sending the same kind of politicians and expecting a different result. It's time for the next generation to step in.
Mr. Bowen, your thoughts on water?
Yeah, I would like to address a couple of points with that. Number one, the Utah legislature passed a law allowing water to be going to the Great Salt Lake as beneficial use. I think this was actually a big mistake. To Carolyn Gleick's point, you can't legislate the lake level. When I was alive here in Utah in the 80s, the lake was at flood stages, and they were pumping it out into the desert. And it will be at flood stages again. But the pioneers recognized that water is a critical resource for Utah, and beneficial use meant using it for farming and to live, to drink. And changing that definition to allow a certain amount to go down to the lakes, very dangerous for our state. Also, my Republican opponent, who is a former Democrat, I'll point out that he didn't refute that. He was chair of the Democrat Party in Utah County from 2001 to 2002, passed legislation giving federal money, which means federal strings, to Utah water authorities. That's also very dangerous.
I do want to just remind all candidates that any time you specifically refer to another candidate on the stage, they will get an additional 30 seconds. I heard both Ms. Gleich and Mr. Curtis referred to. However, I didn't really hear it in a negative way that you would need to respond to. So, Mr. Curtis, we will give you 30 seconds.
What's negative about being a former Democrat if you were?
I agree.
Whether it's negative or not, it warrants a rebuttal, and you have 30 seconds for that.
Yeah, you know what? I'm very proud of everything that I've done in the past, and I've worked hard consistently throughout my life to promote what I would call Utah values. And 3 decades ago, Carlton, I did work within the Democratic Party because I thought the Republican Party was losing its base. In Utah County, we were electing Republicans without anybody having a chance to vote on it. It was all done in back rooms, and there were lots of reasons that I can't explain in 30 seconds. But if you're damning somebody because they were once a Democrat, you have to rule out Donald Trump, you have to rule out Ronald Reagan, you have to rule out Jason Chaffetz.
On that note, okay. Mr. Curtis, we're going to have to move on.
Sure.
Can I get a rebuttal to that? He did mention my name.
I'll give you 30 seconds.
Okay, great. Yeah, my problem isn't with being a Democrat. My problem is getting elected as a Republican, but on several key issues continuing to vote like a Democrat. He's mentioned that the climate is his main issue. This is more of an issue of the left, and he's very involved in the climate and going to the UN climate caucuses, which have an agenda that's harmful to Utahns. And so I think that it's not just the party affiliation, it's what that represents after being elected as a Republican.
Ms. Gleich, you're saying
I would just like to chime in and just illustrate that this extremism and this is not what the voters of Utah are most concerned about. It's not about who marries who or whose bathroom people can go to. That's not the role of the government. And I feel that our current leadership is taking us down a dangerous path. I'm someone who studied risk and risk management, and it's time for the next generation to come in and get our country and our state back on track.
This conversation actually leads quite nicely into our next topic, and that is political climate of the day. Utah voters listing it as one of their top concerns when it comes to political discord in this year's election. And we take a look at some things that have gone on in the Senate. There has been some pretty harsh partisan divide there, particularly when it comes to nominations, the filibuster rules, and also spending bills. So as Senator, how would you work to bridge these political divides? Ms. Gleich, the first response goes to you.
Well, we have seen an extreme level of polarization, and I think back to when I got my start working in government, working for Ted Wilson, a Democratic environmental advisor, an absolute legend for Utah, working for a Republican administration for Governor Gary Herbert. And I saw this beautiful example of people coming together who don't always agree on things, sitting down, finding common ground, and finding a path forward. And I know as a voter and as a citizen, I don't think about issues as red or blue, and I don't think about states as red or blue, and I don't attach a DNR to things that I care about, like clean air or climate action or reasonable government that solves problems. And one of the things I think is really leading to that is the current leaders that we have in office today and the extremism of the Republican Party pulled to the right by the leadership of Donald Trump. And that is something that I will continue to stand up to and to really get back to addressing these issues that we need solutions on.
Mr. Bowen, your thoughts on political divide and how you would work to bridge that? Well,
number one, having a disagreement, it doesn't mean that you're being disagreeable. And just because I bring up things, I'm not doing it in a disagreeable way, and it's very factual, so that's totally appropriate. I disagree that Utah voters don't care about values. I think we care a lot. We've seen men competing in women's sports. We've seen women getting injured. We've seen Title IX arbitrarily interpreted by the Biden administration to mean including that men can compete in women's sports, when the very intent of that legislation was for women to be able to compete against women. And so I think these are very relevant issues. And as this is Mitt Romney's old seat, okay? Mitt Romney was the only Republican out of the entire House or Senate to vote to impeach Donald Trump in 2020. And I think most Utahns didn't like that. And I think it was very out of touch with what Utahns expected their U.S. Senator to be. And I'm concerned that my GOP opponent, who is a former Democrat, will be a Romney 2.0.
Okay, the question goes to you, and you were once again mentioned by name, so you'll get a 30-second rebuttal as well.
Good. We'll just start with my 1 minute, I believe. So I think what you're seeing in a little bit of this back and forth, although not terrible, is exactly what Utah voters are tired of. It makes great campaign slogans, but it's not governing. And I think one of the things that people know about me, and hey, I'd love to point out, I just won a Republican primary with 4 contenders with almost 50% of the vote, is that I do go back to govern, not to campaign. I do like to solve issues. I've passed almost 20 bills into law in the 7 years I've been in Congress. Almost all of that time has been in a divided Congress. That means you have to get Democrats, you have to get Republicans to find that cross-section where they can both agree to that legislation. I pointed out our public lands bill. I'll kind of switch and marry in my 30 seconds because Carlton is just bent on this former Democrat thing. You know, Utah voters get to decide who represent their values. I'll point out again that almost half of all Republicans picked me in a 4-way Republican primary because I represent their values, and nobody on this stage is known better to the voters than I am. I like that lane. I like where I'm at. I think the voters like it, and once again, they'll get to decide in just a couple of weeks if that's in harmony with their values.
Since I was mentioned by name, could I get a rebuttal?
No, I did not hear you mentioned by name.
I was mentioned twice by name.
I did not hear Carlton Bowen come out of.
He said Carlton twice.
We're going to move on.
Okay.
We're going to move on
I think
to.
30-second
We have a student here from Weber State University with a very
excellent.
important question that she wants to ask. So we are going to move on to that. Her name is Marina Paul, and the floor is yours.
I'm working with Weber State Votes to register, prepare, and educate students on campus. Do you believe that the younger eligible voting population should be more involved within the voting system, and how do you plan to reach them so they stay engaged?
Mr. Bowen, you are first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the younger generation has a lot of potential to influence elections. And I think there's a lot of great people in the younger generation that do not register to vote and do not vote. I would encourage them to do so. It's a question mark how to reach this generation. Is it through video games or through social media, depending on the gender maybe, because there are differences. Although I have a daughter-in-law who's an excellent gamer, I will say. But yeah, I think it's important to reach out to the younger generation, for them to be involved. And I think there is, you talked earlier about political climate. And on the campaign trail, I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of people. And I notice some people are triggered, like you bring up the word Trump, and people, like reason goes out of their head, they get emotional, they walk away. And that is, in fact, impacting the younger generation. There's a lot of people that are afraid to speak up on issues like values in their class because they feel like they'll be silenced and basically rejected, which is unfortunate.
Time is up. Thank you for your response. Mr. Curtis?
Yeah, I'd love to point out that the 3rd Congressional District, which I currently represent, is the youngest district in the country. So thank you for your question. I think it's very relevant. Obviously, youth here in Utah is a big deal. So I'd just point out a couple of things. If we're going to connect with the younger voter, if we're going to get them engaged, first of all, we have to go to them where they're at. We have to use their tools. Obviously, social media is a big part of that. I'm really proud of the work that me and my team does on social media to connect and reach out with people. But it's more than that. We have to understand the issues, the things that are important to you. Today, housing's been brought up. That's obviously a big worry to many people in that demographic. Climate's been brought up. That's obviously a big issue to many in your demographic. And we've got to be able to talk about these things in a way that they relate to them. And I fear that too often my party just complains about you not being engaged and doesn't spend enough time explaining our principles and why we feel the way that we do. And hopefully we can do a better job of that.
All right, Ms. Gleick, the question goes to you.
Well, thank you for that question, because one of the biggest goals with my campaign is to inspire young people to get more involved politically and to inspire the next generation of leaders to step up and to run for office. At 38 years old, I am the average age of America. Utah is the youngest state in the nation. We are one of the fastest growing states in the nation. Meanwhile, the average age of the United States Senate is 65. With all due respect to the older generation, Utah deserves a leader that is more in touch with the issues that young people are facing today. And as Utah's next senator, I will work diligently to ensure that young people have access to government as a problem-solving tool. And I will do that by having universal voter registration when you get your driver's license. I will work to have universal vote by mail using the great model that we have here in Utah. And I will make voting day, election day, a national holiday, and also pass comprehensive campaign finance reform to end Citizens United and ensure that corporations and billionaires cannot buy an election.
Okay, we referred to a little earlier nominations specifically, which is a responsibility of the Senate. Let's dig deeper into judges, though, and how they are nominated and, more importantly, confirmed by the Senate. It wasn't that long ago that judges could go before the Senate, and it wasn't all that controversial. That has changed as of late. So talk about what it is, the most important qualities that you would look for when assessing a judicial nominee as to whether or not you would give them your confirmation vote. And this question goes to Mr. Curtis first.
Yeah, obviously, for me, number one qualification is, do they understand the Constitution? Are they committed to the Constitution? And will they interpret the Constitution the way the founders intended rather than the whims of the political day? So that's very important for me. I think if there's a second characteristic, it would be the character of that individual. And then, of course, their service and their education and the other things play into it. But number one for me is the Constitution and the adherence to the Constitution as intended by our founders.
Ms. Glake.
I also firmly believe in our founding fathers' vision in the separation of powers and the check and balance overseeing these branches of government, the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. But currently, our Supreme Court has been radicalized by the appointment of these nominees, and we've seen some really troubling decisions that are impacting our everyday lives and that are eroding that separation of powers and that check, especially on the executive branch. We should all be deeply troubled by the Chevron decision, by the presidential immunity decision, and the overturning of Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs decision. And so some of the things that I would do to change that are to enact a binding code of ethics for Supreme Court justices and to enact 18-year Supreme Court justice term limits to ensure that these leaders are not being influenced by billionaires, special interest groups, or other types of corruption.
Mr. Bowen, if you were the next U.S. Senator from Utah, how would you assess a judge?
Well, I would also use the U.S. Constitution, but I'll note that the U.S. Constitution had very few roles for the federal government. The Founding Fathers established our Constitution basically to provide for national defense and diplomacy. And what my opponents are proposing and what they have voted for is way more than that as far as what they fund and increasing the debt ceiling, all of that. I disagree with what was said about the Supreme Court rulings. I actually think the Supreme Court rulings are excellent. And I think the justices that have been put on the bench are actually applying the text of the Constitution. And that's why we're getting these excellent rulings that go back to the original intent of the Constitution. I would also use that as a criteria. I mean, it's the main criteria, but I think my understanding of the Constitution and what it allows the federal government to do and what it doesn't is much different than my opponents.
I'm going to take a follow-up on this one real quick, and we're going to have 30 seconds each. There's been some talk about potential terms and limits when it comes to the U.S. Supreme Court or even at the federal judge level. Would you support those or not, and why? Mr. Curtis.
Yeah, no, I like the Supreme Court. I find it ironic that when the Supreme Court is not making decisions that are in harmony with an individual's beliefs, somehow it's the fault of the Supreme Court. I join Carlton in saying I like the decisions. The Chevron doctrine is an incredibly important decision, not just for the United States, but for Utah. Our federal agencies have grown way out of control, and the Chevron doctrine is one way to rein them in. So I don't support term limits for them. I don't support increasing or packing the court. And I think the Supreme Court has done a fabulous job through the last few years and, quite frankly, through history, even though I haven't agreed with all their decisions.
I absolutely support term limits for our Supreme Court justices and for federal judges. And it's because the longer that someone is in office, the more likely they are to be unduly influenced by foreign actors or other influences, corporations, billionaires. And yeah, we need to make it easier to have new leaders step up so that we get fresh ideas and better leadership and representation.
Mr. Bowen, 30 seconds for your thoughts on term
Well,
limits.
it's the U.S. Constitution that establishes the judiciary is for life. And so you'd have to do a constitutional amendment to change that. And yeah, I'm opposed to that. I think that we just need to have good vetting by the U.S. Senate, which is one of the primary roles of the Senate, to make sure that judges, are going to vote the way that they say, that we understand their judicial philosophy. And so, no, I'm opposed to changing the Constitution to do that.
All right. We're going to now dip into foreign policy. As we speak, really there are several global hotspots. Talk to us about who you think or what you think is the greatest threat to United States interests currently and what specific actions should be taken to manage that. Ms. Gleich, it goes to you first.
One of the most defining moments in my life is when I had the opportunity to visit an aircraft carrier deployed in the Adriatic Sea under NATO control. And I was inspired to go on that trip by my father, who is a Korea Air Force veteran. And on this aircraft carrier, I felt enormous pride in the young men and women that serve and that worked with NATO countries around to ensure that we are standing up to the rise of dictators nationally. And what worries me internationally, what worries me is seeing the Republican Party that is trying to get the U.S. to withdraw from NATO. That will harm our standing, and it will be a huge impediment to the defense of democracy worldwide. I'm deeply troubled by the rise of authoritarian regimes around the world, and we need to stay in NATO and to stay with our democratic allies around the world.
Mr. Bowen, your thoughts on the biggest threat to United States interests globally?
Yeah, well, let me just say to start off with, since I didn't get it included in my opening statement, is that I served in the United States Air Force honorably. And my wife of 37 years, Linda, and I, we have 6 children and 14 grandchildren, we've lived in Texas, Virginia, and South Korea. So I disagree that the Republican Party has been trying to withdraw from NATO. I think that President Trump very wisely was getting NATO member countries to increase their donations to NATO. I think he actually helped NATO a lot. And again, I'm the only pro-Trump candidate. I really appreciate and support what our president has done in the past and what he will do again in the future. I don't know why a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate from Utah would not endorse our President Trump, the Republican nominee for president.
Mr. Curtis, your thoughts on the biggest global threat to our interests and specific actions?
I'm going to give you a long-term and a short-term. For me, long-term is China. I lived in Taiwan for 3 years. I speak Mandarin. I was on the Chinese task force in the House of Representatives. And while I dearly love the Chinese people and the Chinese culture, I'm very worried about their leaders' dictatorship that is as hard on their own people as they are on other people. Our relationship with China is severely broken, and we need to fix that relationship. We don't have the option of decoupling. We need to fix the relationship. Long term, I think that poses the greatest threat. Short term, I'm worried about, obviously, Ukraine. I'm worried about the Middle East. I also had a chance to live in Jerusalem in 1979 when Jimmy Carter signed the peace accord with Egypt and Israel. I was there. In my office hangs the newspaper that I kept from the next day with the 3 of them shaking hands, which people said would never happen. Bottom line, we have to distinguish who are our friends and who are our enemies. Iran is not our friend. Israel is our friend. Hamas is not our friend. We've got to be very clear. Putin is not our friend. We've got to be clear who are our friends and who are not.
Immigration is our next topic, a big concern also for voters, and it really has been a focus of campaigns both here at the state level and the national level. Congress has talked about but struggled to pass legislation when it comes to immigration. So as a senator, what must be included in legislation for you to be able to support it, and what would be a deal killer? Mr. Bowen.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can tell you that I support legal immigration. I'm opposed to illegal immigration. We need to enforce the law. The problem with immigration isn't that our laws are defective, it's that we aren't enforcing our laws that we currently have. I will note that my Republican opponent, who is a former Democrat, sponsored a bill, H.R. 6637, that basically provided amnesty for illegal immigrants. And I am opposed to amnesty. You asked what I would not include. I would not include amnesty. It just encourages people to break the law again in the future. It's a huge problem. If you do amnesty as a compromise, you just continue to have this problem be worse more and more down the road.
Mr. Curtis, that question goes to you. When it comes to immigration, what would legislation need to include, and what would be a deal killer?
Yeah, and may I add a few seconds more to deal specifically with the amnesty charge?
Yes, but if you
Sure.
would like, let's get into your answer first.
So
and then
I think what you're seeing is politicking versus governing. It's very easy to stand back and say amnesty. It's very easy to stand back and say, whatever, that we didn't vote for this bill or that bill. The reality of it is we have a broken border and we have a broken immigration system. And anybody who puts their neck out and tries to put a plan forward has their head whacked off by the political extremes. As you alluded to, I agree with you that there are political extremes. Let me tell you what amnesty is by his definition according to this bill. In the bill that I supported, and I'm proud to support, it's called the Dignity Act. It actually is one of the best answers I've seen. It had a provision that said if you are here illegally, for the next 10 years, you have to pay a $1,000 fine every year. You have to report to the police and designate that you came into this country illegally. You have to demonstrate English proficiency. You have to obey the law. And at the end of 10 years, you go into another 5-year program, which, by the way, during the first 10 years, 2% of your wages go to a fund that builds the wall. The next 5 years, you demonstrate English proficiency. And at the end of 15 years, after you've paid $10,000, 2% of your wages, you are now eligible to go to the end of the line. And that's called amnesty. Now, you can see why we're not making progress on this in Washington, D.C. We've got to get away from this narrative. And look, we could solve this in an afternoon if we just had...
Mr. Curtis, we need to wrap that up. And by the way, I gave you 1:30 to answer that question.
All right, thanks very much.
Ms. Gleich, the question is yours, and I will be lenient with your time as well.
Well, we need to tackle this issue. We need to solve this issue, and we need to secure the border where it is economically and environmentally feasible to do so. We need to fund and deploy more border agents, and we need to deploy modern technology to stop the influx of fentanyl. Beyond that, we need to provide immigrants, vetted immigrants, with a legal pathway to citizenship. And folks in Congress had the opportunity to do that, and they failed to take action. And I would pass the bipartisan immigration bill that Congress worked for over a month on. But beyond that, I think we need to put ourselves in our immigrant community's shoes, because Utah was founded by people who came here to find a better life for themselves and their families. And I would expect that our officials and our leaders would have more kindness and compassion in our hearts to how we treat our immigrant communities, because they are our neighbors. They are hard-working, tax-paying citizens here, and we need to do more to ensure that they feel safe and to stand up against this hateful and denigrating rhetoric that I've seen around our immigrants. And last of all, we cannot go back to the Trump-era family separation policies. Those were inhumane and cruel, and I feel strongly that our immigrant communities deserve better.
Could I get a rebuttal to that, since she referred to me as hateful?
Well, I didn't hear her refer to you as hateful there.
She just said that she was... Okay, that's fine.
I didn't hear it as though she was directing that specifically at you.
She
so
pointed
for
her
the
arm
sake
at
of
me.
conversation and what those who are here to hear from you as the candidates, I would like to make the judgment call and move on to the next topic. And that is abortion. The U.S. Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, leaving it to the states to decide. So what we have seen since then is a patchwork of laws throughout our country. Many, because of that, are calling for federal legislation to make it standard across the board. Do you believe that that is the way to go, or do you support it at the state level? And this one will first go to Mr. Curtis.
People that know me know that I'm absolutely pro-life. But we don't talk about enough the fact that I'm also pro-life of the mother. And I'm also pro-life of that baby after it's born. And yes, the Supreme Court did make a decision that sent that to the states, and I support that decision. I believe that's where it needs to be. I also think that's where we're going to find the most thoughtful conversation about how to deal with this. Let's be honest. Republicans tend to talk about the babies incessantly. Democrats, as a stereotype, tend to talk about the mothers incessantly. Both of those are important. We've got to find the common ground between those. And I think that's best done on the state level. And I think what you're seeing here in Utah, where there's vast agreement that we need exceptions for the life of the mother, for rape and incest, and that we have to have a thoughtful conversation about the overall health of the mother altogether, are important conversations that will happen better on a state level.
Ms. Gleick, would you support a national standard, or do you believe it's best handled at the state level?
Well, since the overturning of Roe versus Wade 2 years ago, we've seen these dire unintended consequences of the Dobbs decision. In states like Utah with this uncertainty, we've seen 1 in 5 OBGYNs considering leaving. We've seen an increase in the number of women who die during childbirth. And we have also seen this spread into attacks on IVF. And for my husband, Rob, and I, IVF may be the only way that we can start a family in the future. My opponent has said, I wish as a man I didn't have to make these decisions. Well, Representative Curtis, you don't. And it's long past time to end this egregious government overreach into our most personal and intimate decisions. Utah deserves a U.S. senator that trusts families to make the best decisions for themselves, free from government intervention.
Mr. Bowen, your thoughts?
Yeah, there's several things to unpack here. So a baby's heart is beating by 6 weeks. It has its own blood supply, which is different from the mother's blood. By 10 weeks, a baby is fully formed, 10 fingers, 10 toes, organs, the entire child. Abortion ends a human life without that human life having any input into it. So I'm 100% opposed to abortion. Now, my Republican opponent, who is a former Democrat, said that he is pro-life, and I'm glad to hear that, because there was a recent interview of one of his staffers who said that actually he isn't. So I'm glad to hear that he is. To get to what my other opponent was talking about with abortion, the leftist rhetoric is harming women. There is no state in the United States where you cannot get health care for a miscarriage from an abortion, but there are women who are afraid to get it, and the same with IVF. That is not an abortion-related issue.
Okay, Mr. Curtis and Ms. Gleick were both specifically mentioned. So, Mr. Curtis, we will start with 30 seconds for you, and then Ms. Gleick, you'll have 30 seconds as well.
First of all, the quote was not, as you quoted it, the quote was, I wish there were more women in elected office to help us make this decision, and I stand by that. I wish that were true. Second of all, I think what you're hearing from both of my opponents is why this is so divisive. Let's agree, to begin with, it's very divisive. And when you throw out things like, I don't support IVF, how ludicrous is that? I don't know anybody who doesn't support IVF and view it as pro-life. And so I think it's time that we dial down the rhetoric, that we have serious conversations about how to move forward.
Okay, Ms. Gleick?
Well, my opponent and other House Republicans have introduced legislation that would effectively ban IVF, the Life Begins at Conception Act. And the Project 2025 agenda would defund and close Planned Parenthoods around the country. Now, Planned Parenthood is where people go to receive treatment for STDs, to get cancer screenings, to be screened for ovarian, cervical, and other types of cancers. And so these decisions are going to have a dire effect on Americans' ability to receive life-saving reproductive health care, because abortion is health care.
We are getting very close to time for our closing statements, so we're going to go to a few quick lightning round questions. We'll give you about 15 seconds each on these. So the first one is the federal government doing all it can to provide assistance after natural disasters? And this one goes to Ms. Gleick first.
I would say no, because just last week we saw 200 Americans die in the aftermath of Helene. And our current politicians have voted against funding for FEMA. And so, no, I do not believe we are. And we're also not doing enough to address the climate crisis.
Mr. Bowen?
America is about self-government. We're supposed to be able to help each other out. And FEMA is preventing people from doing that, and there's actually no constitutional authorization for FEMA to go in and take charge and prevent other people from helping. So absolutely no, we're doing a poor job.
Mr. Curtis.
FEMA is failing. I wish everybody could go watch Ron DeSantis be interviewed about his response. He was ready. His state was ready. They had tens of thousands of utility workers ready to go to work. I suspect Utah would do the same thing. And we can't just rely on the federal government.
All right, next question. We're quickly approaching. I want to remind you again our time for closing statements. Day one, if you get elected to this, going into office, what would be your first priority, your first line of business? Mr. Bowen.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to audit the Fed. We have a Federal Reserve organization that's never been audited by Congress, and it handles a lot of money, a lot of potential for corruption.
Okay. 10 seconds to you, Mr. Curtis.
Permitting reform. It's one of my biggest issues right now. It's one of the biggest impediments to our national security, to our energy future. So clearly permitting reform.
Ms. Gleick.
Ending fossil fuel subsidies and making polluters pay for the devastating impacts of the climate crisis.
All right. We have now reached the end of this debate, a random drawing held earlier, determining that the first closing statement would go to Mr. Curtis. And we will go ahead 1 minute to you, Mr. Curtis, for your closing thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks again, Glenn. I think you've done a great job tonight. Thanks to the Debate Commission. Thanks to our audience. Thanks to the voters of Utah. If you watched me closely, you know this was not an easy decision to run for this office. I wanted to know myself that I could be the type of senator that you would like me to be. And I want you to know, after serious thought and reflection, there's several things I'm absolutely certain of. The founders believed that we should serve for a season. And if I'm fortunate to serve you, my season will be hallmarked by stewardship and service. I want you to know that your issues will be my issues. Your agenda will be my agenda. My voice will be to amplify your voice. My vote will be to reflect your values. Together, we can bring Washington, D.C. closer to Utah's values and, more importantly, make our country the type of country we need it to be for our children and for our grandchildren.
Ms. Gleick, your closing statement.
Throughout this campaign, I've had the opportunity to travel the state and to hear from you. And I've heard you, Utah. You are concerned about housing, about paying your rent and your mortgage, and about being one healthcare crisis away from losing the roof over your head. I've heard from young people who have debilitating anxiety about the future of our planet, about the air quality. I've heard the concerns about the attack on our public lands and the lack of access to life-saving reproductive health care. You deserve a leader that truly reflects the will of the people. I'm an environmental advocate, so I'm all about reduce, reuse, and recycle, but we cannot keep recycling the same old politicians and expect them to get out of this mess. It's time for the new generation to step up. And if you feel like Utah is headed in the wrong direction, we need to ask ourselves a question. What do you call a politician who's been in office too long? You call them home. And Representative Curtis, it's time for you to come home to send the next generation in.
All right, that is your minute, Ms. Gleick. Mr. Bowen, we will end with you 1 minute.
This race is about who will replace Mitt Romney to represent Utah in the U.S. Senate. There's a Democrat on the ballot. There's a former Democrat on the ballot who, while as a Republican, has refused to endorse his own party's presidential nominee, who, like the Democrats did, called for his censure and for an impeachment investigation. His main cause in the U.S. Senate as a Republican has been climate change, kind of like the Democrats. Remember the Green New Deal? And who was one of only a few Republicans to side with Joe Biden in exempting China from some trade tariffs. And then there's me, a conservative, pro-Trump, independent American who is for the U.S. Constitution, for traditional values, for traditional money, and for our tradition of freedom. If you want something different than what you've had for the last 6 years in the U.S. Senate, I urge you to have the courage to do something different. Vote independent American Carlton Bowen for U.S. Senate.
All right. Thank you, candidates. We appreciate you being here tonight and for participating. Also, your dedication to public service and willingness to step up in this matter. We appreciate that greatly. We do want to remind all of you that Election Day is Tuesday, November 5th. Make sure to contact your county clerk if you have any questions about making your vote count in this year's election. We greatly appreciate Weber State University for donating